How do you overcome that to show that the value is much more than the expense?
Yeah. Well, the first thing for them to realize is it shouldn't cost them anything. Um, Real estate, commercial real estate works just like residential real estate does. So landlords and sellers, 99% of them have set aside somewhere between 6 and 8% of the sale price or the lease price for commissions. So it's not going to affect your deal at all, in the negative. It can in the positive a lot for you to pull somebody in to help you. So it shouldn't cost them anything. If they've talked to an agent and they want them to like pay retainer fees and things like that, I would tell them to walk away from that. It shouldn't cost them anything.
Welcome to the Real Estate Mogul MD podcast. Thanks for tuning in and taking control of your financial future. This is a show where we not only motivate and inspire, we give you actionable real-world experience to help you live life by design. You'll hear journeys and stories from other physicians, investors, coaches, consultants, and entrepreneurs. And now, here's your host, Brett Riggins.
Commercial real estate is typically the second highest expense behind payroll for most healthcare organizations. A poorly negotiated lease or purchase can cost a healthcare organization or franchise tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars. We're going to have an amazing conversation. Like always, I get to throw out these questions and just these repeated situations that I have in conversations with other physicians, dentists, doctors who are expanding, looking to start their practice. And it's all about commercial real estate. I hear it all the time. I don't need an agent. What's the agent? Why do we need to pay them commission? Where does the commission come from? Well, I tell you what, we have found an amazing group called Carr. And Carr is the nation's leading provider of commercial real estate services for healthcare tenants and buyers. Another very specific piece here, tenants and buyers. They do not represent listing owners, property owners. It's specifically for tenants and buyers. And we're going to get into why that means a lot. But until then, everybody, please welcome the Director of National Accounts for Carr, Jennifer Page. Hey, here we go. I'm excited today. Well, I'm always excited. Let me start the show every single time by saying I'm excited. Roll that back, right? But no, excited today for the value that we're going to give to listeners today because Jennifer is here. Jennifer, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So tell the listeners just a little bit why I'm so excited. Do you even know? Because how we're relating real estate to practices today and what you guys do for physicians, doctors, dentists, and other people that are kind of like either in that lease agreement scenario or buying, whether they're expanding or creating new, how you guys help practices in that particular time of need. So huge. That's why I'm so excited. Jennifer, tell everybody a little bit about who Jennifer is and where you ended up where you're at today, because you're not a physician, I'm not a physician, but we are licensed real estate agents together.
Yes, we are. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it. So I work for a company called Carr. We are a healthcare specific real estate firm. And we are also buyer tenant only representation, which to your listeners may or may not mean anything, but that is really, really important. Basically, what that means is we only represent people that are looking to purchase or lease real estate. We never, ever represent landlords and we don't represent sellers. And that's a really important distinction because you don't ever want to feel like there's a potential conflict of interest when you're looking at real estate. And so we took that piece of the transaction off the table for us from the very beginning so that our clients, as well as any of our referral partners, could know and trust that, hey, our clients are going to see anything and everything in the market that makes sense for them. We don't have a dog in the fight. So you're right. I am not a physician. I am a real estate agent. My background is actually in dental. Prior to coming to Carr, I worked in the dental world as in sales and operations and some consulting too, and got to know the Carr agent that was in my market and saw the difference that they can make in the lives of these professionals and decided to take the leap and do it myself. And 5 years later, here I am.
Wow. So a little bit of the dental background and dental operation to me is like, oh no, I don't know what dental. Well, we're talking about a different operation there, right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
so you met the car agent and saw the value that you'd bring, and you mentioned, not having a dog in the fight is very interesting because within the last month or two, I've had a couple of situations where I've had an agent representing both myself and the listing, the seller, which is confusing in real estate. Sometimes they call it seller when it's actually the buyer. And why do we do that?
Yeah,
I don't know.
yeah, I don't
But
know.
anyway, the
Complicate
person
things.
selling it and the person buying it. Let's just keep it simple. And
Yeah.
the agent was representing both of those. And I don't know if the agent had more uh, experience or a big stronger relationship with the listing person, but it did not feel like that person was representing me. It was one of the deals. It was a 6 deals, but one of the deals didn't go through, and it just felt like there was nobody at the table with me. It was only to maintain that relationship with that person that had the other property. So I can vouch for that, and then I can also understand the other side too of this whole disclosure thing about dual agency, right? And what does that mean? And how many people actually know what that means?
I
But when
don't.
it comes down to it, I think you have a perfect saying of not having a dog in the fight, right? You
Yeah.
don't have both sides of the table that you're trying to please. And the idea of the fiduciary responsibility, can you have that if you're on both sides of the table, right?
No.
So I can see the value in that. Let's generalize here and talk a little bit about um, how does Carr save? Let's talk about leases first. How
Okay.
can Carr save a listener even up to $100,000 on the next lease renewal?
Yeah, yeah. Well, the first way is just by getting us involved because we're professionals and that's what we do, right? Going back to kind of what you were talking about as far as not having a dog in the fight and all that, if you're trying to do it yourself, like you're on the losing end of that battle. If you think about the landlord or the seller, they have representation, right? And a lot of times these landlords, this is what they do for a living, right? But they still hire somebody to handle that transaction for them because that's what they do for a living. When these healthcare professionals go and try to negotiate the deal themselves, or like you said, the dual agency with the same agent, I tell them, I said, it's kind of like walking into a courtroom as a defendant and expecting the prosecuting attorney to also defend you, right? So does he have the skill set? Sure. Is it in your best interest? No. So the first thing they need to do is use a professional, right, that knows what they're doing. Don't do it alone. Second, as a healthcare professional, I highly recommend they use somebody that has a healthcare focus. Uh, Not all tenants are created equally, right? So you don't represent a nail salon the same way you represent an optometrist, right? Different type of value, different type of tenant. They should have different concessions from the landlord. The buyer tenant focus, let's go back to that. I think that's a really important distinction that you use somebody that doesn't represent landlords because you want to make sure that there isn't a conflict of interest. And then, that agent that's working for you, they're not just working on getting the best price, the best lease rate. There's a whole strategy involved with how you look at properties, how you negotiate, and taking other things into consideration outside of your rent. You need to look at abated rent. So like a free rent period for build out or for getting, your operations up and running.
Transition. Yeah.
Yeah, the tenant improvement allowance, all kinds of different things. So, a lot of times what I have found, and it's really kind of sad, is not just healthcare professionals, but just tenants in general that don't use representation, they kind of look at signing a commercial lease like they do signing a lease for an apartment. They think you just go and you ask and you find out what it costs and you sign the document. And when you do that, I mean, man, they are signing away tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Mhm. What is some of the biggest mistakes that you see going into this? And say, I know it's a wide range, even so focused, there's still a wide range of clients that you work with. But say in the dentistry world, I see a lot of dentists who own their own practice,
Mhm.
and either need to lease a space or buy a space. So what are some of the common mistakes that you see when there's no representation, when there's no experience at the table? Because let's get this clear, that's not taught in medical
Right,
school, right?
right,
And
right.
it's just a piece that kind of happens in the transition. Um, but what are some of the biggest mistakes that you see happen either on a lease or on a purchase? And to say, if we just focus, say, on dental practices.
Um, Getting laser focused on one property. They treat their commercial space like they would maybe their home, right? When you're out looking for a home, you find the one you want and then you go for it, right? And you just negotiate the heck out of it till you come to a best and final. When people take that same approach with commercial real estate, they're going to lose. So negotiating on multiple properties in a lease scenario is critically important. One, you want the landlord to know that they're competing for your business. Two, you want to have something to compare it to. You want to be able to look and see, well, why is this landlord offering this, but this landlord's only offering this, right? So you get the comparisons and you use them to get the landlords to move in the direction that you want them to. And then not having the right advisors in place, like not using a real estate specific attorney. I can't tell you how many times that's messed up deals. They use their brother-in-law, that's a divorce attorney or something like that, to negotiate the legal terms. But I think probably the biggest one is not giving themselves enough time and not knowing the market and negotiating on multiple properties. That's so critical. And honestly, they just don't know how to do it because it's not their specialty, right?
Do you ever get into any scenarios where a stipulation of the lease agreement includes some sort of revenue basis
I know
or
what you're talking about.
share or?
Yeah, no, not really in our world. I mean, you see that some in retail, like they want a percentage of, their income. I've never seen a healthcare professional agree to that. But you make a good point because some of these folks are going into retail locations. Like you see a lot of dentists in retail, you see veterinarians in retail, you see optometry, physical therapy in retail. And so, if you don't have somebody paying attention to those things and that slips by you, that could not, turn out well.
Mhm. And if you're working with a client who is buying and not leasing, how does that work? I mean, you basically have to tell them no, or end the relationship then after they buy. So I'm going to give you hypothetically here.
Okay.
I am a dentist who's going to buy a commercial space that has maybe 3 units in it. And I'm only going to use 1 unit.
Mhm.
So I'm going to buy that. But now I've become the land owner, the property
Mhm.
owner, and I need to have to work with somebody else to get those other 2 leases, those
Yeah.
other 2 units leased up.
Yeah. It's a
How does
great
that make
question.
you feel?
Yep. Our highest and best use of our time is doing what we do well. You can't be all things to all people. And our agents get asked to list things all the time because we do such a great job. But the cool answer is for that professional that wants to hire us, to list their spaces is because we don't list. Um, we have a very good read on the listing agents in the market. We know who the good ones are and we know who the not so good ones are, right? Because we're not a threat to them, right? Like we're working with them all the time to get deals done. And so in those scenarios, we're a great resource to let the doctor know maybe who they should list it with. So we just kind of pass that off and stay in our lane.
You get a referral for that?
Sometimes we do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that resource, that is a big resource. What markets do you work in the United States?
We currently have about 135 agents all across the US. I can
Okay.
only think of a handful of states where we don't have somebody. I know we don't have anybody in Hawaii. So if there's anybody out there who wants to go to Hawaii,
Yeah.
we don't have anybody in Alaska. But I mean, we have ways to get deals done in just about every state and just in all the major markets. So we're the largest healthcare specific firm in the country. So you're not going to find a firm that has more coverage in that space than we do.
I hear this a lot, and I've had personal experience with some physicians who don't feel they need an agent. And I've had this conversation before on the show. Um, how do you overcome that? Because it's so far into the process when I've seen this where it's like, oh my goodness, you don't have an agent
Yeah.
and you're literally spending millions of dollars on this.
Yeah.
Um, the cost should be part of the acquisition process, and the
Right.
value should exceed the cost when you're working with the right person. So how do you overcome this? There's listeners out there now is like, I've been looking for my spot, whether it's a lease or buy, I've got this, I can do this.
Mhm.
How do you overcome that to show that the value is much more than the expense?
Yeah. Well, the first thing for them to realize is it shouldn't cost them anything. Um, real estate, commercial real estate works just like residential real estate does. So landlords and sellers, 99% of them have set aside somewhere between 6 and 8% of the sale price or the lease price for commissions. So it's not going to affect your deal at all. In the negative, it can in the positive a lot for you to pull somebody in to help you. So it shouldn't cost them anything. If they've talked to an agent and they want them to like pay retainer fees and things like that, I would tell them to walk away from that. It shouldn't cost them anything. And our biggest competition really is people not knowing that we exist. Um, Doctors that want to do it themselves, I can't imagine a reason for wanting to do that unless you just enjoy the process. Like as far as
Well, my experience with that person who's doing it without an agent is conservative, is penny pinching. And for the listeners, my hands are up in the air
yeah,
of
the air
not
quotes.
wanting to pay anything,
Yeah, it shouldn't cost them
not
anything, but
seeing the value.
it stands to save them tens to not to hundreds of thousands of dollars. I
Mhm.
mean, I can think of several deals right off the top of my head that I closed early on. We're talking about way into six figures, three, four, $500,000 in concessions and rent reductions. So, um, if they're concerned about the pennies, then they need to be calling an agent,
Mhm.
because that's where their best deal is.
Interesting. And the other piece of that too is I've experienced these conversations, these situations happening when maybe it's direct to seller or direct to owner kind of scenario. So there was no, again, air quotations here, commission figured in.
Right.
And then this whole new mess with the National Association of Realtors. I'm not going to get started on that,
Yeah, let's not.
where that goes. But the commission not being there or not
Yep.
being listed, and then all of a sudden every single seller or uh, listing person is, I'm not responsible for that. I don't have to pay that. So that's the new thing, right?
Yep. Yep.
So that's all of a sudden there is a scenario where it's starting to push to the commission for you,
Mm-hmm.
the buyer or the lease. Was it leasing and lessor? I don't know the perfect words for those, but the person getting the lease
Yeah.
um, has to pay for those
Yeah.
things. So we're walking into a pocket now. It's almost like a new or a different world. But we could continue to push and say, okay, that's seller. Push it back on the
Yeah.
seller. I
Yeah.
know that I've got a good tenant. I know that I've got a strong buyer here. If you want to sell it, this is the way that it works.
Yeah. We're actually not seeing that rule affect commercial for us really at all. I think it's kind of putting residential more in line with commercial. We're always negotiating our fees. Like
Mhm.
we don't ever have anything set, right? So we're not really seeing that as an issue. Um, as far as landlords or sellers being unwilling to pay a commission. You do run into that sometimes with like mom and pop sellers, that maybe they've had it in their family for 100
Mhm.
years and they don't know how real estate works and all that. And you know what? When that happens, um, Carr has a pretty strong stance on that. Like, we just do the deal pro bono then. You know what I mean? Like, we know that goodwill will come back to us. And we all do several pro bono deals a year. And so if that's a scenario and, you know, and it turns out that we can't get paid on a deal, then we just don't get paid on it. But we don't ever ask our clients to pay our fees.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So yeah, where's the downside?
You tell
You
me.
are, yeah, right. You are focused on the medical profession. You have the experience that goes along with that. So there's just so much more to gain, and then pushing back on the seller providing or the listing um, providing the commission. So really, there's so much more value than anything else.
Yeah, there's only value, really, because the other thing that our team does, which doesn't really relate to the transaction itself, but because we're so focused and niche, we also have lots of relationships with other folks in the industry that can benefit these doctors or healthcare professionals like CPAs, general contractors. So if they got a space and it needs to be built out, we can direct them to the folks that have the most experience there. Just all the players, right? And so we can bring a lot of value there as well. So they're really, I mean, of course, I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but there really isn't a downside, right? I mean, there's really only an upside.
How often do prospective clients come to you and say, "Okay, Jennifer, I need a space. Um, this is where I want to be. Go get it." And you're like, "Okay, well, what's your budget?" And they say, "I don't know."
Yeah.
I mean, how often does that happen? And how do you walk a prospective client or a client through that process? How do I know what I can afford?
That happens a good bit, especially with startups, right? Like maybe your doctor, your dentist that's been associating somewhere, they've been there a couple of years and now they're finally ready to get out and do their own. And that's really a very fun transaction for us. A lot of car agents really like doing those because you do get to hold their hand a little bit more and be a part of that process. And in that case, we just say, well, if you don't know what your budget is, let's go find out. And so that's when we introduce them to a healthcare specific lender that can walk them through, okay, what does your production look like? And they can set that up. Okay, well, you're going to qualify for this much, and they benchmark it. Like your rent can't go over X amount of dollars. This has to be earmarked for build out. Those healthcare lenders are very, very valuable. And so we partner with those folks all the time, and that helps solve that problem right there.
And your experience in these buildings, like not again, maybe coming from more of an inexperienced practice, as far as visibility, parking, uh, code restrictions, zoning restrictions. Is that something that you and your team also work with the prospective clients with?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Definitely. Yeah. And those are some of the things we talk about when we like kind of do our first meeting or like our vision casting meeting is find out, what kind of spaces appeal to them. Because I mean, you can have a dentist that wants to be in a medical office complex tucked away in a hospital campus somewhere. And then you can have another dentist that they want to be on Main and Main, right? Next
Hmm.
to the Starbucks. And so kind of knowing what's important to them is a big part of our due diligence. And then yes, confirming zoning, that's on us as well. So when we're doing our research, we're reaching out to listing agents and saying, hey, one, will the landlord allow this use? Because just because it's the zoning is confirmed doesn't mean the landlord will allow it, right? And making sure there's not any exclusive. So if you think about like a Target or a Walmart, those centers typically won't allow optometrists in there because
Oh,
there's Walmart optical, there's
yep.
Target optical. So they won't let, a lot of times like Petco or PetSmart, they won't allow a veterinarian in there, not because they offer veterinary services, but they don't want you setting up and selling dog food.
Hmm.
Right. So yeah, all of those things is part of our due diligence to making sure that, that you're going in a space that you're allowed to be in and that zoning will allow for it and meets the criteria like of what that doctor is wanting is visibility, parking. You need to think about things when you're talking about parking, like maybe we're in a small strip center that has a restaurant in it and you go by at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and it looks great, like plenty of parking, great visibility. But if you went between 11:30 and 1, maybe there's no parking, right? So
Hmm.
just all those little things that people may not think about considering because they don't do this every day, right?
Right. Lease versus buy.
Yeah.
Which is the best?
It depends.
Mhm.
Um,
What's it depend on?
Yeah, well, it depends on the individual's situation, the individual healthcare situation, and it depends on the deals that they're looking at, right? The lease versus the purchase. That's another tool that we use a good bit where we can put into a comparison spreadsheet. Here's your lease option. Here's your purchase option. Here's what the numbers look like. This one makes more sense for you financially versus this one. And so it really is case by case dependent.
Mhm. Where this commission that we talked about in these scenarios, and I come across this question a lot too, is like, okay, so it's included, it's not included. How in the world do agents get commission off of a lease?
Yes, great question. So the way that works is, let's say it's a 10-year lease, which a lot of healthcare deals are 10-year deals. What you're going to look at is how much gross commission is the landlord earning over the life of the lease. So you just add all of that up, and whatever that final number is, whatever, like if it's a 6% commission that's being split between the two agents, then you just split it up, 3 and 3, right? So that's where the number comes from, the total gross commission over the life of the lease that the landlord is earning, and it's a percentage of that.
So just a hypothetical here. If we had a $10,000 a month lease, and does that include the TICAM, the taxes, insurance?
We love it when it does, but no, most of the time we are not paid on
Okay.
operating expenses. No,
Okay, so that
just
would
the
be
base,
aside. This is just on gross rent.
just base rate.
So if
Yeah.
we base rent is 10,000, that'd be 120,000 a year, and on a 10-year deal, that's $1.2 million. So
And that's it, and that's if the lease doesn't escalate. So most leases have an
right.
escalator in them too. But yes, for simple math, yes.
Yep. And then that percentage, you say 6% is a
Usually
typical
6 to 8%
lease?
is the full listing, right? So that 6 to 8% gets split between the landlord
Okay.
agent and the doctor's agent.
Okay, so let's just say 3%. So times
Yep.
0.03. So $36,000 commission. How does that get paid?
Uh, Everything's negotiable in real estate, right? But typically what we see is the landlord pays half of the commission at execution of the lease, and the other half gets paid when the tenant takes occupancy of the space. So it's
Okay,
usually
so
like a delay of 4 or 5 months after they do their build out.
okay. So that's even before, it sounds like, depending on how well Jennifer negotiates the abatement, before the
Exactly.
landlord even gets a dime, they
Mhm.
have to come out of pocket for this.
Yep, it's their investment. Yep. And it's the same thing how the tenant improvement allowance works. A lot of times landlords are coming out of pocket some significant cash to
Mhm.
help the doctor build out their space, and all of that is ahead of time too before they make their first dollar.
How often do physicians on a build out pay their own tenant improvement, TI?
If they're not represented by an agent, typically they pay 100% of it because nobody's going to
That's a
offer
huge
that.
piece. So
That's a huge
if the
piece.
tenant is not represented by an agent, it's very typical that that tenant is going to be paying the TI, the tenant improvements, because that's just what they've negotiated or
Why would the landlord offer them?
right.
Right? Unless the landlord knows that they're competing for their business and they're looking at multiple options, but most people aren't doing that, right? So so yeah, I mean, if they're doing it on their own, none. If they're using an agent that knows what they're doing, it can be six figures.
Wow, that's huge. So we've touched on some in my mind, a lot of the questions that I hear on the front side. Do we miss, or are there any other questions that you get a lot that, you hear a lot, get asked a lot that we didn't talk about already?
Trying to think. I guess, how do you get most favorable terms on your lease? Like, what's the position you need to take? And for that, I would just say, finding out what's motivating the landlord is pretty important. Not all landlords are the same, so you can't approach each landlord the same way. How much time does it take to do this right. Like, let's talk about a lease scenario. Like, you're not going to go out and start looking for a location for your practice to lease and be ready to move in 60 days. Like, that's just not going to happen. It's not like residential. Like, you need to give yourself probably a good 9 to 12 months, and that's moving at a pretty good clip. And then also knowing how hard to negotiate and when to stop, right? Because negotiating is an important part of real estate, but knowing when to stop negotiating is pretty much just as important, right? When to stop pushing.
What do you mean by that? What do you mean by when to stop pushing or stop negotiating?
There are just some people that they like the art of negotiation and they just keep negotiating. And there's a term in real estate that's called deal fatigue. And if you just keep browbeating a landlord or a seller with every little thing over and over and over again, at some point they're just going to be like, I'm tired of this, and they're just going to walk away. It's not going to be worth their time, especially if it's a lease scenario, because they're like, I'm going to have to deal with this guy or this girl for the next 10 years, and I don't want them in my space, right?
Yeah.
And so knowing how to negotiate and when to stop. And what I mean by how is, don't piecemeal it. Like, knock it all out at once. Like, here's what we want. What is this going to cost us? And then they come back with their answer and you go, no, we're not willing to do this or this or this. This landlord is offering this, and so you're not competitive. You know what I mean? Like, just instead of just piecemealing it at them and just not stopping when you need to stop.
Yeah, I completely understand that. But I guess the other end of it too, just making sure that you're holding your end too. So not beating them up over every little thing, but make sure that the deal that where you need to be and not giving in along the way. And there's a book, it's Never Split the Difference.
I love that book.
Yes, I cannot think of the gentleman's name.
Hostage negotiator guy.
Yeah.
Yes, I think I've
It's
got
red
it.
and yellow.
Yes.
Anyway, it'll come to me. I'm not going to Google it right now, but
Yeah.
great book. And the thing about negotiating in that book that always stands out is you will never walk out of your closet with one black shoe and one brown shoe. It's not a win-win situation. That's kind of what happens when you give on your negotiations. And that's separate. That's different than winning one thing, bringing back another thing, and beating the deal up and getting this deal fatigue you're talking about.
That's right.
So,
and a lot of that is Brett, just knowing your numbers, right? That's a tool that we use is what we call a comparison spreadsheet, where we put the numbers in an Excel spreadsheet so they can see, okay, this is how much this is going to cost me over 10 years. This is the landlord's investment into the deal. This is how much it's going to cost me. Like, being able to see that in black and white and really knowing your numbers and knowing, if you're asking for the landlord for tenant improvements and for concessions and free rent and all these different things, you need to make sure that you're not asking for something they're going to look at and throw in the trash, right? So if the dollar amount of the concessions that you're asking for is like 50% of what they're going to earn over the life of the lease, why would they do that, right? So you got to know your numbers and know, like, what's a good deal for you, but also still a fair deal for the landlord.
what is typical for a listing agent or a landlord to ask for when hey, I want this space, I like this space, and the process starts? What are typical financials that you're able to provide or willing to provide to start the negotiations?
So it depends on the client, for one. So we have really two different types of clients at Carr. We have our doctors, dentists, optometrists, single docs, and then I oversee our national accounts team. So our national accounts are franchises, large dental service organizations or medical service organizations. And so what they're going to ask for from one over another is different, but typically it's going to be for a doctor, it's going to be tax returns, right? Things like that. Maybe a letter from the bank showing that they've qualified, for a loan. If you're a national account, It's going to be, your P&L, your balance sheet, maybe some tax returns. So it depends on who the client is.
Interesting. So, how do the listeners get a hold of you? No, I've got your website is carr.us. So it's
Yep.
CARR.us. But what's the best way the listeners can get a hold of you? Because I'm sure that you have, whether it's consulting calls or just answer questions, I'm sure you guys provide so much value up
Yeah.
front that it's very easy to see that this is the right way for a prospective practice owner or someone who's going to look at leases, that the value is there, that they need to work with specifically a physician related or a dentist related um, agent. What's the best way for them to get a hold of you?
Yeah. Well, they could always go to our website and find me there. But the easiest way is probably just to email me directly, which is jennifer.page, Jennifer.page, no I in page like a book,
Mhm.
at carr.us.
Jennifer.page, page like a book,
Page like a book.
at carr.us.
Yep.
Very cool. Well, that is great. And I know that there's a lot of value here because I'm throwing out some questions that I've had just based
Yeah.
on the conversations that I've had before, and I know that you've heard these. So this is another instance where if the listener is out there who is either on the front end of that deal, maybe looking to expand, whatever it may be, you're going through similar challenges that other people have. So this is another perfect scenario. We need to expand our association
Yeah.
and build that network out, because when we leverage relationships, those relationships compound. And just like you're saying, well, what's the build out going to cost? How does the accountant look at this? Who's the lender? How are they running the numbers? There's so much to it. So much here. Thank you for your time, Jennifer. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. I really enjoyed it. Thank
Thank
you.
you. And the listeners out there today, again, this is another one of those instances where we're not selling anything. It's not what we could get from you, it's what we could get for you. And this is another instance where there's another opportunity here, whether you're looking, considering, or actually making moves. Now's the time to reach out and expand your association and build your network. This is just a great opportunity to work with teams nationwide that do this consistently, consecutively, and that's their focus. That's their one thing. Let their one thing be the one thing. You hear that in medicine a lot. Keep your one thing your one thing, right? Well, it's all about expanding associations. And thank you for your time giving this a listen. Check them out. Reach out to Jennifer, send her an email. And as always, thank you for your attention. This is Real Estate Mogul MD.